Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Pamela Gerber. Pamela has a long track record of working in sourcing and procurement, and that has given her an opportunity to form a perspective on the importance of investing in the right talent. So, hi, Pamela. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Hey, good morning, Kelly. Glad to be here.
Now, before we start talking about procurement talent, something that everybody is highly focused on these days, I wonder if you'd be willing to just share a little bit about your professional background to give us a little bit of context before we start the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It is not a straight path to procurement, as many in the profession, I think, could describe from their personal journeys as well. If I look back, my path to undergrad was really defined to be a criminal attorney. And with a backup plan, if I didn't move forward with that, was to go into advertising and public relations. Please don't ask how the two mesh. The only mesh there is really kind of the human factor and psychology behind that. I did continue to pursue the criminal attorney path, took my LSATs, but I funded my undergrad, and funding law school and paying off undergrad at the same time seemed very daunting back then. So I pursued going right out after undergrad and landed a job in a very large global ad agency called Gray Advertising in Manhattan, and started my roots there in account management for major brands. Great experience. It turned out I loved it. I pivoted within a few years of that to help bring Samsung to North America and onboarded as the assistant advertising and public relations director. So I had great experiences there. And then found myself having to relocate to South Florida, where some of my family had migrated at a very young age. So I had to kind of walk away from that career path that really wasn't available in South Florida, but I had roots in merchandise buying. I worked full-time as a teenager through high school for a major retailer in their corporate office. So lo and behold, that's where I restarted when I moved to South Florida. And I had an opportunity to start with an early startup that was in a year of their beginnings called Office Depot.
A company certainly everybody's going to be familiar with.
Yep. And so, this is in the early 90s, and was there when they went public a year after I joined. And that was really the roots of where my global supply chain and then ultimately moving more into the specialty of procurement and strategic sourcing was founded. I was with them for 9 years. I helped start up lots of the functions. And I think that's where my entrepreneurial training and spirit was born, along with agility, resourcefulness, and all those things that you were just expected to do. The company was a very young based company from the leadership on down, and you were just given new opportunities. And I just saw that as, okay, I guess I'll do that now. So I don't think I had the sophistication to realize why I was being asked or cherry picked. Many of us were, but it took me many years to realize that that's what I was good at, is jumping in, starting from the ground floor, building it quickly, building it successfully, and with little or no resources or training. And that's really where I think my career training really began. And that company and the roots of that meant a lot to me and still does. It's very different today. I did go back for a year in recent years, but under very different leadership and a different mindset. And then from there, after the 9 years, I pivoted and worked directly in manufacturing, large manufacturing, global manufacturing companies. I think my reputation began as a change agent before the word change agent was being used, and was asked to come in and reinvent or reorganize full global supply chain functions from end to end. And Within several years after that, I started to specialize and realized that what I really liked was the strategic sourcing side of all the supply chain functions. And so that's where I think my career has been focused on the back half of my career. I managed direct and indirect spend, but my focus really, and the depth and breadth of what I really like the most is on the indirect side at this point. So definitely not a straight line. And when people ask me that question, including people on my previous teams and direct reports, it's okay. How do I get to where you got it? I'm like, well, you have to be open. And I think that's the best answer I can give them because I didn't plan it. Certainly, it wasn't even a discipline when I went to school.
Yeah. No, and I think most of us found that. It'll be interesting given how you talked about really enjoying the strategic sourcing piece of procurement. I'll leave this up to you. But whether you want to talk about the challenge of establishing a talent foundation in procurement broadly, or if you want to narrow it more to strategic sourcing, because I do think there's enough depth of skills requirement in strategic sourcing to look at that sort of on its own merits. But why do you think it's so difficult, despite how much effort has been made, to really establish here is the core talent you need to work in this field?
Well, I think you've talked about 2 points, and I think I'll talk it as a whole with an arm to strategic sourcing. I think, certainly market conditions today, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But in the broader sense, I think procurement leaders today, we're still grappling with not just nationally, but internationally, even in the trade organizations of how we are known, right? What's the difference between purchasing, procurement, strategic sourcing, category management? It's very confusing, even to, executives in the company. They don't understand the difference between, and we have to continue to try to part the waters and educate, what is transactional versus what is really the strategic side and how do the two interrelate to each other. And that's where I think there is still a lot of pain points, and that affects hiring and resource and organizational planning because of that confusion and misunderstanding. I think it's still a big component of it. And even in the titles in companies are different across every company I've been in. And it's like, we just don't have consistent titling, which leads to confusion in what does that role really do? What's the level of expertise required? So the fundamentals of how we've grown up over the years in the industry is very confusing to people, including within your own companies. So we have to be constant ambassadors of how we talk about what is the broader sense of supply chain, what comes under supply chain, what is the procurement component, what is the strategic sourcing component under that umbrella, and then what is purchasing and the operational side, and how does that cross into that? And I think that's a big part and a big responsibility that we all should be doing regularly.
Now, you made reference to market conditions, and I'm interested to hear sort of what's your perspective on trends that are being seen broadly and maybe how that's filtering either individual people's careers or into how teams are being structured and set up. What are some of the things that you're noticing there?
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on, obviously, and we could say just like everything, every generation has its issues and foibles going on. And it's just a question of what's going on in your generation. I think if you take a look at specifically procurement and global supply chain, obviously the market it is a major factor, how it's morphed from 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, a year ago, right? I think you could look at the impact of COVID, right? And then what's going on right now in global economy, tariffs, trade, international. It is spinning off its axis, and procurement professionals really have to be on the front lines and try to get ahead of it as much as they can, and then engage their leadership on road mapping. It is getting more challenging. I think there are many factors besides that as well, where technology is coming into play. All we hear about is AI, AI, AI. Yeah. And I am a big proponent, even though I've been in industry and am a seasoned and a professional, right? I think there's a stigma about us that, we're not driven by technology. We are the drivers of technology. That's how we're getting to where we are, and we know how to make those pivots. But AI certainly is a big impact. Is it ready for certain things? Does it really replace the human factor in procurement? I think those are some of the considerations and concerns that are impacting how companies are considering AI, and not really thinking about the full impact and where it's going to fit best. And it is affecting resourcing and resource planning, and tools that you're bringing in and what that's replacing and the impact of what that's replacing. So I think, we're in a very pivotal time in our history right now, with those types of tools. And I think AI is moving fast and furious in terms of how it's improving. And it's a great option for procurement in many areas. Some are better right now than others, but it's quickly catching up. I'm doing a project on translation services in a global perspective.
And interesting.
Yeah. So while there are still human linguists that we're going to use, it's more now the conversations in this about how and what their AI tools are, and country by country, and the colloquialisms in certain regional areas. Some are better than others. So you can't buy into that holistically yet. So there's those types of impacts, I think, are really front and center right now. And I think we'll see more in the next year. And it may not be it may be the next big thing. And it goes back to the pace, not just for, of course, procurement and supply chain. It's the upstream and downstream of every function that has to kind of pivot with this. But definitely procurement is on the front end of this in every way. We're addressing stakeholders and how they would utilize that in service areas and how we support them, and also how procurement tools can be impacted by them. So we've got both sides of the fence to grapple with.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting because whether it's understanding how to leverage technology or where there's an appropriate use case, whether it's potentially category expertise that procurement is expected to have, or whether it's some of the procurement, let's say operational skills, analysis, negotiation, then you layer on top of all of that, well, now you need to also have people skills and communication skills. And a lot of those take sort of the category, technology, operational expertise, and open the door to potentially having influence. Have you seen cases of where people are especially effective taking their technical know-how or their operational abilities and managing to leverage that up so that they actually have influence and gain some level of seniority in the organization?
Yeah, I think you brought up the other point that I was getting to, is that, the soft skills, which is really what you're talking about. Now, I've started to see, that with, 30 somethings coming into my team that may have all the degrees and certifications, but you still need the soft skills, right? Because you're still dealing with, whether it's a lower level leader or top C-suite leader, and how you have to present in front of them, and the psychology of that, not just internally, but also with your external partners, right? It goes a long way, as you said, in sophisticated negotiating. When you get into large multi-million-dollar deals and there are nuances and fine points, how do you weave through that successfully? Those soft skills, building those relationships, having that level of relationship can be a game changer in opening up doors in how you come to the table and how you land at the end through those dialogues. And, it's just like being on the golf course. Sometimes those conversations really help seal better deals, frankly, in terms of understanding each other and talking through how can we be more creative together as partners. I've had that in many cases, especially in my last organization, in dealing and making successful deals in very tough circumstances. Example was, we were going to be going through an M&A that, of course, was not announced yet, any inside or outside yet. I had to renegotiate a lot of our major deals, knowing what was coming down the pike without letting the cat out of the bag. And so having those relationships built and those soft skills that I really had strengthened really got me deals that I never would have gotten and set us up well for the merger and acquisition. So it's really important. But to go back to your question about the technical and helping that build the influence, yes, definitely. But that goes back to knowing when the right time is, right? To introduce those things into the dialogue. How much is too much for certain areas of the company? You're talking to an executive, may not be as sophisticated. They want the macro version, not the micro version. When you're dealing with leaders within those specific areas, then they're in the nitty gritty. So I think it goes back to those soft skills again, and AI can't address that at this point.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because so we've talked about different areas of technical skill. We've talked about soft skills, but then not necessarily captured by either of those is sort of a go-getter spirit. And I do think, given how many of us never intended to end up in procurement and yet did and love it now that we're here, I do feel like that's sort of a common thread that runs through, because in order to accept that kind of offer or invitation, you have to be the kind of person that says, sure, I had never considered this, but why not? Like, this could be a new professional adventure. Are you also seeing the people that you're coming in from the market, degrees and experience notwithstanding, being willing to sort of seize some of these opportunities as they present themselves?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. You know, one of the things I wrote down before we actually were going to have this chat was about seizing opportunities, and me personally, which, you know, people who knew me very early on, was major introvert, very quiet. My parents would say the still waters run deep. And it took me many years. The person talking to you is not what you would have confronted. And so this didn't happen overnight. I think being put in a lot of these opportunities, either that I was seizing or were presented to me, forced me to really have to become that person, and to build that integrity, that trust and relationships and things. I'm great at relationships. I'm just not outward. I do them in small groups rather than big groups and whatnot. So to take those skills, but the comment I wrote down on the note, and it's almost identical, what it said, is that you have to be the type that thrives on new learning and a bit of the unknown, or a lot of the unknown. And in today, I think even more of that. When that comment was really based on where I started. Today, I think people that are either existing in the team, who have not had to respond that way, kind of that middle level, and they're facing it, it's a bit daunting if they're not of that automatic personality, and they need leadership to support them through. And those that you're bringing into the team, you know, I think that generation expects constant change and turn. They do have a bit of an expectation of getting to the top faster with less experience, you know, which isn't always the case. But I think there's a couple of different camps there, depending upon where you're in the industry and how long, and also what your personality type is. And you have to recognize that not everybody, even if they're in the function, is prepared for that or wants that. And you need those stable factors still behind the scenes, to, you know, run the steady ship and not be part of the constant churn or swirl. But I will say that the churn and swirl is here to stay right now. I don't see that backtracking anytime soon. I see more and more of it. And you just have to be part of that lazy Susan and be ready for the ride.
Yeah. Now, we've talked a lot about sort of falling, or in some cases even tripping or stumbling or taking a wrong turn and ending up in procurement, but loving it once we get there. Are you seeing any evidence that there's a second dimension to that, where in some cases people fall out of procurement? Either they say, okay, I feel like I've learned everything this place has to teach me, I want to try something else. or they get scooped up by some other opportunity that they encounter in the process of working within procurement. Are you seeing any signs that people are starting to fall out, or does it tend to be more of a, we all still fall in, but once we're here, we're here?
I think there is. And that's going on in other career paths as well.
Sure.
I think, COVID set a lot of that off more outwardly about people looking at what they're doing, how they're doing it, who they're doing it for, how they work every day, remote, hybrid, whatever. It just set a whole new thought process going. So I wouldn't say it's only happening in procurement, but I do see, I've even had it from some of my team members. Even when I brought them on, I've told them this is a launching pad for many things. And the dialogues I've always had, especially building teams from scratch, is, I'm bringing you in, and I've had people that don't have procurement background, but they have, MBAs and data analytics and all these other things, and they get exposed to things, and then they want to go into the sourcing side or whatnot. But the way I've always approached it is a launching pad. You're going to touch so much in strategic sourcing in these areas, and I'm going to set you free in the business. And if there's another area in the business that, as a result of being in this, that you really want, I want that tribal knowledge to stay and that talent to stay in my company. And so I'm one of those leaders that encourages that, right? Because it's really good crossbreeding in an organization. And I think many others have that going on as well. And a lot of associates are driving that themselves. I'm ready to do something else. This is not my end all be all, but I started in this and I've had so much exposure that I feel now I'm ready for something else, or to take those tools, right? Because the tools that sourcing and procurement professional have are so translatable in so many ways. So I definitely see there is an element of that going on. Where that trend is going to continue, I'm not really sure at this point. Look, I'm at a point in my career where I'm being approached for things I wouldn't have considered before that are really not completely embedded in specifically procurement. It's strategy development, right? It's that type, because that's where I am at this point. So I'm also starting to look at what's my next venture at this point in my career. I'm not ready to retire. And I don't want to become stale either. There's so much to do in procurement, but at a certain point, we get to a point where if you're of that ilk, which apparently I am, I need something new. So, but I do see earlier generations reaching that point sooner. And I think that's because there's a lot more exposure with social media, trade networks, and everything else that is how we live today. That's how we communicate today. So everyone is seeing everybody else and what they're doing, and that inspires them to think, maybe I want to do that.
Now, Pamela, we have a tradition here on the Sourcing Hero podcast that I want to bring you in on. And this will be really interesting because you sort of opened us today by talking about how you really like the sourcing piece, even within the procurement realm. So I'm going to give you two questions. You can pick either one, and there are no wrong answers. So your choices are, what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? Or if you want to think about sort of where you are today, career-wise, strategically, and go bigger picture, what do you think heroism looks like in a business context? So I'll give you the choice.
Yeah, I could answer to both, and there's going to be some common components to both. But I'll take the what heroism looks like in a business context today, because I think it's really important with what's going on in the world, especially with a lot of well-known companies and the massive layoffs going on. I have been affected by this since the very beginning of my career, where a lot of my peers weren't. I just happened to hit them all. So I have a lot of experience in the merger and acquisition, the bankruptcy, the downsizing. I just did my sixth one in my career. So I am like an expert in that. But what I think has disheartened me really is that it's like a seesaw effect with companies. It's up and down, and a lot of this is driven by leadership and more of a short-term or selfish perspective for many of them. So for me, the heroism part is really those companies, right, that are doing the right thing at the right time, right, even when it's really hard, right? And they're using their business as a platform for good from the beginning all the way throughout. It never wavers, right? They've made those decisions very early on in their company and their building.
Yeah.
It trickles down through their branding messages continually. It trickles down in their culture throughout the company. They don't just talk the talk, they walk the walk. Office Depot in the beginning, in that first generation, was exactly that company. So that's kind of been built into me. And I've worked for many a great company, but not all of them really live and breathe what they say.
Mm.
And when the tough times hit, how did you get to the tough times in the first place? I'll give you some example. Bombas is a great example of what I would consider heroism in a business context. They made it their business from the time they were a startup of how they were going to live in the world and how they would set up supporting in homelessness with the product that they make, and how much every sale of a sock, right, creates a donation of the same within that category. And they're still doing many things, and they're known for this. Everyone who knows them, whether you're a consumer or you're on the commercial side of the business, knows this, and they live and breathe it. Leadership in other companies, right? Planning better, looking at their horizons better so that they're not going to have to go to massive layoffs. And if they feel that there is a business impact, look at COVID. The company I worked for at that time thought about employees first across the entire company, as hard as that decision was, and said, we're going to do a short-term minimal furlough. And they brought everybody back very quickly, right? That was their biggest concern, because it was the associates that make the company. And those companies that really have that perspective, and the leadership drives that from top down, and they will sacrifice themselves, whether it's sacrificing their bonuses and other things, to say, we need to clear the path, right, until we get over these humps, whatever you can do. I think most companies today, and it's become very public, don't do that. Don't do that. It's just, we sacrifice everybody else and we just keep going and expect that that's okay. And I think the world, not just the employees that work for them, but the consumers, are very dissatisfied with how this is going. So for me, heroism in business is, how do you live and breathe every day, right? How do you really stand behind, right, what not only your service or you sell, right, but what else are you doing in the world besides, the basic philanthropic causes that many companies do? How does your brand really present itself in the market today? And how do you really treat your associates, right, so that they can continue to live and support you, because they are the mainstay of your business.
Well, and it's interesting as you talk about brand too, because I think some of those, and I'll just call them right decisions, but we could say good decisions. Some of those decisions that are so hard to make end up being the ones that age the best. Sometimes you can make a decision in the spur of the moment and you say, well, this is what we need to do to survive today. And that might be true, but it's probably one of the decisions you're going to look back 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, think, if only in that moment we had done things differently. And that's a really interesting way to bring all of this decisions and trends and external factors into context.
Yeah. And I think those leadership in companies, and I've been lucky to report to the C-suite and see the ones that really have those open dialogues, collaborative dialogues, right, to figure out, what do we need to do? What's the right thing to do? May take a little bit longer to get to it, and then communicate that out to the organization. The company that I previously worked for, I joined right at the beginning of COVID to start up a function from the ground floor.
That's not easy.
No, and it was in the hospitality sector, which of course was hugely affected in the industry. And they pivoted extremely quickly and did things that a lot of other companies, but it was based on conversations, what I call the 12 apostles, the 12 executives of the company, who really met as a team, were fluid, ideas on the table, took input from other leaders like myself and whatnot. And really, but the decision making at the core was based on what's the right thing to do, right? How do we sustain our associates? And they led with that on everything all the time, not just through COVID, post-COVID. Was one of the reasons I felt so blessed to be with the company. And associates had longevity in this company. It was well known for this as a culture. They over 30 years of this. So me coming in, I felt I had to live up to that same component in how I presented my function and my team and who I brought in, because this is really what sustains a company and made it successful. We were pulling numbers during early years of COVID that we beat our numbers from pre-COVID years.
Wow.
And this was based on how really leadership managed the company and engaged the associates throughout the good and the not so good. So I think also how you message and communicate to your associates, it was a very personal in front of them, town halls regularly, those types of things, and really being sincere, right? It's not just talk, what sounds good. And too many companies are not really doing that. And it goes back to the leadership, what's really at your core.
Yeah. Well, Pamela, I've thoroughly enjoyed having this conversation. I really appreciate that you've shared so much of your own personal experience in what we've talked about today, because I think there's a lot that everybody not only can relate to, but can take away from that. So thank you so much for joining me for this episode. Thank you for being part of the Sourcing Hero podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. This has been this is my first one. My virgin podcast. So thanks.
Well, now you can say you are a pro. You can check that off your list of things to do.
It's a check my bucket list. Yeah, but thanks for making it. Thanks for inviting me to do it, and thanks for making it such an interactive dialogue, Kelly. I really enjoyed chatting today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.